Bob, thank you so much for spending this time with me today.
Rosemary, one of the topics that we discussed at the beginning of our conversation that the agency will require be taught to charter board members and school board members is the topic of health and safety. And the requirement is to spend about 30 minutes on that. Actually, we could probably spend a lot longer on it because the health and safety rules are inclusive of the student disciplinary rules, and student disciplinary matters are worth a great deal of consideration. The health and safety aspects of the Texas Education Code are found in a chapter, chapter 38, that strangely enough is called Health and Safety. And the disciplinary matters that I spoke of just a minute ago are in the chapter right before that called chapter 37. Well, these aren't the only health and safety laws that will refer to and apply to your charter school. There are also requirements under federal and state laws that deal with health and safety issues, and we'll talk about those briefly. Now, Chapter 37, as I said a moment ago, is the disciplinary laws that have been that are applied to the public school districts, and for the most part, actually don't apply to charter school districts or charter schools. There are certain aspects of Chapter 37 that will apply to the charter schools. And just as in any other parts of the Education Code, any of the Chapter 37 laws which describe criminal offenses with a penalty attached will apply to your charter schools as they will to the public school districts. Let me see if I can think of a couple of examples. Yeah, in Chapter 37, we have a provision that deals with hazing activities. Hazing on your campus by your students, participation by any of your employees in hazing, can result in a criminal penalty. In other words, it's a crime. In the same way for the charters as it does for the public schools. And the reason why is because these statutes actually describe within them the kind of offenses that are involved and the range of punishment. And so they become statutes that establish a criminal offense applied to your charter school. There are also some federal laws which are implicated by Chapter 37 that apply to your charter school because Chapter 12, the open enrollment charter school laws, say they do. For example, when we're dealing with the expulsion of students because they have brought a weapon onto your campus, the federal laws are implicated, and certain expulsion provisions, which we'll talk about in a minute, have to apply. And so these are some of the Chapter 37 rules that will apply to your charter school. The traffic laws that are in the state and apply on your charter school campus in the same way as they will at public school campus. How do we know that? Because they're found in Chapter 37 also, and these laws talk about the penalties, the criminal penalties that would be involved for their infractions. Your school can require personnel IDs, student IDs, vehicle IDs. You can reject undesirables with no legitimate purposes on your campuses. Why can you do that? Because these are some of the laws that are in Chapter 37 that are made applicable to your charter school. The laws dealing with disruption of education that are found in Chapter 37. The laws dealing with no alcohol, prohibition of alcohol on the grounds, no tobacco on the grounds, school grounds that are in Chapter 37. These apply to the charters in the same way that they will apply to the public schools. In addition to the hazing statutes that I spoke of just a minute ago, there's another set of statutes that are found in Chapter 37 with criminal penalties, no less, that apply to the public school districts and your charter school. And those are the statutes forbidding fraternities and sororities, secret societies, and gangs. These are institutions, organizations where you're enrolled by decision of the membership. You can be blackballed from these things, in other words. These are forbidden for the public schools. They're, of course, likewise forbidden for the charter schools. And this does not include organizations that enhance public welfare. In fact, the statute itself refers to Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and says that's okay. So similar type organizations can exist without being in violation of those laws. Now, I mentioned a moment ago the federal gun laws and expulsion rules. Let me tell you something about them. The federal law says you will expel from the regular campus. Now, you can put them on an alternative campus, but most charters don't have an alternative campus. You will expel from the regular campus for at least 1 year students who bring firearms to the school. Now, there's an exception to that. The superintendent or CEO of your school can modify the length of time. So although on the one hand the law says that you must provide a 1-year violation, a 1-year penalty, that can be modified on a case-by-case basis by your superintendent. Point is that your policies should spell that out. Your student code of conduct should spell it out. And if the child is under 10 years old, according to the federal law, and you do expel them for this purpose, keep in mind that you are not permitted to take them out of school. But what I mean by that is you can expel them, but they must be provided with alternative education services because they're under 10. Now, Chapter 37 has another section that, through Chapter 12, we know applies to open enrollment charter schools. And I spoke of those a few minutes ago, but I'll tell you a little bit more about them. It's these restraint provisions that apply to special education students. They include seclusion, physical restraints, and, as I said, do not include time out. They are sometimes difficult to understand what this statute means. But there has been some recent adoption of statute by this last legislature that has clarified some of the more confusing rules involved with seclusion and restraints. And I'm sure that your administrators will be familiar with that, but your board should know about it too. There's federal laws that deal with health and safety that go beyond the federal gun laws, and there are such things as the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm sure you've heard of the ADA. The ADA has two main thrusts. One is with regard to facilities, accessibility, for new construction and for renovations, for alterations. You need to be able to accommodate the disabled. This is monitored by the state, and your attorney and your architect will have some details for you on that. The other aspect of the Americans with Disabilities Act has to do with employment decisions or student decisions. But it doesn't have to do with the facilities part of the act, as I just mentioned. There is a requirement under federal law to remove asbestos, friable asbestos, when you find it. When do you find it? Well, you find it in many, many instances where a school has been built or renovated in 60s and 70s, sometimes almost into the 80s. What part of the construction do you find it? You find it in floor tiles. You find it in ceiling tiles. You find it in the gauze that wraps the boilers. You find it in the glue that glues the floor and the ceiling down. You can find it in the asbestos shingles that may be on the outside of your building. If it's not broken and particleized, you may not want to break it and particleize it, because once you do that, you'll be able to remove it only through certified removers. A record has to be maintained. The whole Asbestos Hazardous Emergency Response Act will be invoked, and there's even Texas statutes that deal with this. Asbestos can be a very time-consuming and expensive proposition for your charter school. And speaking of state acts, there is a state act called the Hazard Communications Act, where certain chemicals used or stored on your campus have to be handled in certain ways, and certain information called material safety data sheets about what you do in case the chemical comes in contact with human or animal or plant life have to be stored and recorded and maintained along with the chemicals. Now, you might say, Rosemary, hey, I don't have any of those chemicals on my campus, but I would bet that you do. I'll bet you have cleaning solutions. If you got a photo lab, I'll bet you got some photographic chemicals, and you could have some pest control chemicals lying around. All those and other types of chemicals will come under the requirements of the Hazard Communication Act. So you should know about it, have a policy about it, act about it. And speaking of pests, when you're getting rid of them, and of course I'm talking about the 6- and 8-legged kind, you must have either a licensed pest control business do your work for you, or a certified employee who has taken the training, and you have to have used the required notices and safety precautions. So just don't start running around the charter school kitchen with your can of Raid. And there's other state, federal acts that are going to apply to your school too, as if there weren't enough. When you're dealing with 6-year-olds and under, and you know or suspect there may be some lead in the paint around, lead abatement certification and removal is required. If you've got gas or oil pipelines running across your property, there are certain notice requirements and biannual tests, and these are handled by state law. If you got a leak in a storage tank of butane, gasoline, underground storage tank of some type, chemicals storage tank, you're going to be contacted by the TNRCC if you haven't contacted them first, or the Environmental Protection Agency from the federal standpoint, and they're going to instruct you in how you handle that, because you're going to have to notify them about it. Safe Drinking Water Act involves deteriorated lead paints. There are acts known as the Bloodborne Pathogens Program under Texas Health Code, which deals with trainings and records in emergencies involving infectious diseases. These all apply to your school. The Education Code provision, Chapter 12, we've talked about that enough, so you know that's your Bible. Chapter 12 says that if you have a school in a municipality that's under $20,000, that you're not subject to municipal zoning requirements, like platting and certificates of occupancy and so forth and so on. Well, tell that to the municipalities under 20,000, because many of them believe that they have the authority, and I think they probably do despite the statute, to impose those requirements on you if their municipal zoning laws require it. But for all other schools that are in larger municipalities, the education code says we're going to treat them the same as the school districts. And that means that you're going to be subject to fire alarm inspections, that you're going to have fire extinguisher inspections, you're going to have certificate of occupancy requirements when you occupy a new or renovated building. There's going to be fire suppression and sprinkler inspections, all the things that would apply to any public building. You may have special requirements in your municipality for the type of wiring system, electrical wiring that you can put in your school, for the type of utilities and plumbing that can go in your school. There are standards that are required for the wearing of eye protection gear, and face washes and showers are required in high school labs where hazardous chemicals are used, and these are all under federal and state statutes. And I don't pretend to have covered every one of these state and federal statutes that are going to apply to your charter school that deal with health and safety, and I'm sure that there's more coming along all the time, but these are the highlights. Now, I'd like to take a deep breath here just a minute and talk about student discipline, because it's a subject very near and dear to my heart. When I first became involved with charter schools years ago, I was asked as a public school district lawyer to give an opinion to a charter school potential client about a student discipline matter. And I remember saying to him, well, just follow Chapter 37. It's very simple. And then I thought, well, maybe I better go look at the law. And I did. I read the law. It's a good thing I thought that. Called the potential client back, who later became and still is a client, because I did call him back and say, whoops, Chapter 37 doesn't apply to your school. You really don't have to follow any of these discipline standards that are in Chapter 37 that apply to the school districts. And then I said something that, for me at the time, considering my lack of knowledge of charter schools way back then, was fairly enlightened. I said, but I think you're going to have to follow the federal standards for due process if and when you expel a child. Well, I have been supported in that decision, in that advice, many times since giving that original advice. And I give it to you and to your board members now. And I am again supported by the Texas Education Agency and the legislature, because just this last legislative session, we have adopted a new set of laws that says, well, you don't have to follow Chapter 37 charter schools. You can if you want, but you don't have to. But there is something that you have to do with regard to student discipline, and that is you must have a student code of conduct. Now, I know many of your schools have a list of violations, but you may not call it a student code of conduct. And my advice to your schools is that they start calling it a student code of conduct, and that you bring it back to your board if you haven't done that as a student code of conduct. And according to the new legislation, that student code of conduct has to have a couple things in it. You have to have a list of the violations and the penalties that will be attached. Of course, you can still have a range of penalties. You could still say, you can be expelled for, and I use this facetiously, sticking chewing gum in class, as well as for fighting. But the important part is that you do describe the range of penalties, and that you communicate these penalties, this student code, to your student body. And of course, depending on the age of the students, you better get it to the parents too. Good way to do that, is to have a student code that you distribute to everyone, and have the parents and the students come in and sign it they've received it. Give them their own copy to take home and look at. Now, there's one more requirement that the legislature has laid on us. And as I told you a minute ago, I think we realized that this was a requirement many years ago, but the legislature now says it's a requirement. You have to follow federal and state due process when you expel. Now, here's where we want to spend just a moment thinking and talking. Charter schools, like public schools, just public school districts, of course they are public schools, but charter schools, like public school districts, are not permitted to say, I'm sorry, I really don't want your child in this school anymore. His behavior is just abhorrent, or her behavior is abhorrent. You can't just say that, and I know some schools have done that, and I think that that perhaps spurred the legislature's decision to promulgate this new law. Because that's an expulsion. So, we need to decide when a suspension from school becomes an expulsion. This is very important because let's say you send a child home for a day. Are they expelled for that day? Let's say you send them home for a week. They're suspended for the week. Have they been expelled for a week? What's the difference between a suspension for a week and an expulsion for a week? Because, you know, you can expel for any length of time you want, except for that federal gun law we talked about earlier. So, the cases under federal law have helped us in that regard. And what one very well-known case has told us is that with regard to suspension, expulsion, if the suspension is for 10 school days or more, the suspension turns into an expulsion. Now, here's the rub, Rosemary. And I think you already know this because as a practicing lawyer, and I'm sure you read the Education Code, Chapter 37, as it applies to public school districts. That 10-day rule is not the law for public school districts. For public school districts, that 10-day rule over the years has gradually been whittled down to a 3-day rule. For public school districts, if you suspend a student for over 3 days, the suspension is tantamount to an expulsion. And for public school districts, in order to comply with both state and federal due process requirements, you have better held an expulsion hearing and made a determination and gone through all the due process requisites for expulsion. So what is it for the charter schools? Is it 3 days like it is for the public schools? Or is it 10 days like the feds have said that it is? I don't know. The conservative approach would be to assume that 3 days is the most conservative approach would be to assume 3 days is the rule. The most cavalier approach would be to take the 10-day rule of that old case and apply it. I'm going to split the baby. I kind of have recommended to my clients that we go in between. And I think that it is likely when these cases come up before the state and federal courts for decision making, and if I knew of a case at this point, I would tell you about it. But they will arise. And when they do arise, I think am going to be pretty comfortable arguing the 5-day rule. But I must tell you that the conservative approach would be the 3-day rule. The safest, you assume 3 days. Now, let's decide for a moment, let's decide for more than a moment. Let's talk for a minute about due process and what is due process. Due process under federal and state standards means fair play. Due process is a changing and evolving concept in law. Due process is derived from the federal and state constitutional protections that we have. Shall not be denied of what's known as a property or liberty interest. And I don't know if I need to go into a lot of explanation on what they are without due process. Well, let me just say briefly that a property interest would be an interest in money, property of some type. For example, you hold a job and you're entitled to a contract under that job, and you work for a state or federal government, due process requirements will come to play. A liberty interest is an interest in a good name. And if you try to take someone's good name and do so without giving them due process, it is possible that a liberty interest would come to play. And either one of those interests would require the application of due process before you take it away. So we have been told through a multitude of case law that expulsions require due process. And the kind of due process that we recommend to our clients is due process provides reasonable notice to the parent and to the child of the rule that we allege has been violated. We talked about that just a minute ago. You got to make sure that that student code is out there, that the student somehow knows what the rule is and that the penalties are involved. That's due process. The second part of due process is if there's a violation, you've got to tell them what the violation is. You've got to describe it in enough detail so they understand what it is that they have violated. And you must give them reasonable notice of an opportunity to appear and tell you why they have not committed this violation. A due process hearing is what we call it, or due process opportunity. I don't know how many days is required, but I would say that at least 2 and preferably 3 days would be good notice, reasonable notice. So you're going to get the notice out there. It's going to go to the parents. It's going to go to the child. You're going to tell them what it is that's been violated. You're going to tell them where this opportunity is going to be, the time it's going to be. They will have the opportunity to have a representative there if they want. Could be an attorney. And they will have an opportunity to examine the evidence that you're going to be presenting, which tells them that they've committed the violation, and present their own evidence and tell you why they haven't committed the violation. You want to consult your attorney on this. There's certain instances where they may have an opportunity to actually examine and question the witnesses. In most cases, not. But there's enough variance in that advice and possibilities of variance in the advice where you're going to want to consult your lawyer. So you provide that due process opportunity, and after the opportunity, then you make your decision known to the student and the parents, and you have provided the due process that we believe is requisite under the law. Okay? Please do not go around denying students the right to attend your school without having provided due process. I'm going to talk about a few more health and safety requirements that have been more recently adopted by the legislature. And they're so recent I have to actually look at my notes to make sure that I'm giving you the right information on this. There's been a recent bill requiring the adoption of the Student Code of Conduct. We've already talked about that. There's been a recent bill requiring the reporting of pending disciplines actions, both suspensions and expulsions, of students that may be transferring from your charter school to another charter school or another school district. And that school district or charter school will have the choice of either completing the punishment that's been assessed or not. But you got to let them know. There's another new provision of the Education Code that's now applicable to open enrollment charter schools, And that requires the reporting of educator misconduct by the superintendent of the school or the director within 7 days of knowing that there is someone in the school as an employee or an applicant that has a criminal record or was terminated or resigned with reason to believe that there was existence of a conduct that involved abuse or other unlawful acts with a student or minor, or if that superintendent or director has evidence to believe that the educator or applicant possessed or transferred or sold or distributed a controlled substance, illegally transferred, appropriated, or expended funds of the school, attempted by fraudulent and unauthorized means to obtain or alter a professional certificate, committed any part of a criminal offense on school property or at the school-sponsored event. The requirement is to report this to SBEC, which is the state certification division for educators. And I'm assuming that because of No Child Left Behind, that many of your educators on your campus will be certified educators, and therefore these reporting requirements will come into play. There's also a new law dealing with the notification of sex offenders. SBEC here is going to notify you of the revocation of an educational certificate, if they hold one, for persons, educators that have committed sex offenses. And if you get one of those notices, you are required, charter school, to remove that person from contact with students immediately and terminate the employment. In other words, this will become good cause for termination, even if there's a contract. Don't forget, if there is a contract, to follow due process standards for contract termination, a subject that we're not going to discuss today, but which is something you should discuss with your lawyer. The good news about this reporting requirement is if you're wrong and the person, the educator or the applicant, has not actually committed one of these things that you believe in good faith that they have, there is absolutely total immunity for you as the reporter. So, those are the highlights of Health and Safety, Chapter 37. I know it's a lot of information, but I hope that you'll take it back to your school and use it wisely.
Thank you so much for all your help today, Bob. I think it's a lot of topics have become clear for our board and hopefully for other boards that watch this tape.
I hope so. Thanks.